My stepdad demanded $400 rent when I turned 18, but when I showed him, I've owned the house since age 6. I discovered my mother hid $130,000 in debt, and now I'll spend 14 years paying it off. I'm 18 years old, I work part-time at an electronics store, and I still can't believe the nuclear bomb that exploded in my family like 3 months ago when Greg, my stepdad, decided it was time for me to pay rent. The thing is, what he didn't know, and what basically destroyed everything I thought I knew about my life, is that I own the house we live in. Yeah, you read that right. The house is mine. It's been mine since I was 6 years old. And trust me when I tell you that discovering that was just the beginning of a financial nightmare that still keeps me up at night. I guess I should start at the beginning, when my biological dad, William, died. I was 6. I barely remember anything about him except that he smelled like coffee and always had paint stains on his hands because he was a carpenter or something like that. What I do remember perfectly is my mom, Catherine, crying for weeks, and then basically functioning on autopilot for like 2 years until she met Greg at a work event. Greg was an insurance salesman, one of those guys who always has a smile ready and pats you on the back too hard when they greet you, you know? My mom married him when I was 8, and honestly, he was always decent to me. I mean, he wasn't my dad, but he wasn't bad either. He was just there. I grew up in this house thinking it belonged to my mom and Greg. Nobody ever told me otherwise. It was a normal house, nothing fancy, 3 bedrooms in a quiet neighborhood, with that kind of backyard where the fence always needs painting but nobody bothers to do it. I went to school, made friends, lived a completely normal life without knowing that technically I was the owner of the place where I slept every night. My mom never mentioned anything. Greg didn't either, and I just assumed what any kid would assume. Things started getting weird right after my 18th birthday, which was in March, I think, or maybe late February. I don't remember exactly. Greg started making strange comments during dinner, like, "You're an adult now, Dylan. You need to start thinking about responsibilities," and I thought he meant taking out the trash without being reminded or something like that. But then, like 2 weeks after my birthday, I came home from work and Greg was sitting at the kitchen table with a super serious expression, and my mom was standing by the sink washing dishes, but I saw her hands were shaking a little. Greg told me, "Sit down, Dylan. We need to talk." And I sat down because, I don't know, when an adult tells you that with that kind of serious voice you automatically obey. He explained that now that I was of legal age, it was time for me to contribute more to the household, which made sense, I guess. And then he dropped the bomb. "I need you to start paying rent. Let's say $400 a month. It's reasonable considering you have your room and eat here." I was like, okay, that's kind of sudden, but I can handle it with my job, although $400 is almost my entire monthly salary. I asked him if we could start with something lower while I got more hours at the store, and he told me no, that 400 was the minimum, that I had to learn the value of money and responsibility. My mom didn't say anything during that whole exchange, just kept washing the same dishes over and over, and I thought that was weird, but whatever. Greg was the one paying the bills, as far as I knew, so I figured he knew what he was talking about. That night I stayed up doing mental math, trying to calculate how I was going to survive paying $400 in rent, plus my cell phone, plus gas for my old car, and I basically came to the conclusion that I was going to be eating instant noodles for the rest of my life. But then, like 3 days later, I was looking for my birth certificate because I needed it for a community college application, and while rummaging through my mom's file drawer in her office, I found an old folder with my name written on the tab. Inside there was a bunch of legal papers I didn't really understand, but one of them had the title to the house, and there, in letters as clear as day, it said that William, my biological father, had put the house in my name when I was 6 years old, right before he died. There was an attached note from a lawyer explaining that the property was in a trust or something until I turned 18, at which point it would transfer completely to my name. I stood there like an idiot with the papers in my hand for I don't know how long, maybe 10 minutes, just trying to process what I was seeing. The house was mine. It had been mine all this time. My dad had left it to me, and nobody had told me. Not my mom, not Greg, nobody. I felt like my brain was going to explode because none of this made sense. Why had my mom never mentioned this? Did Greg know? Was that why he was so eager to charge me rent now that I was 18? That night at dinner, I decided it was time to drop my own bomb. Greg was eating roast chicken and talking about some difficult client at work, and I just interrupted and said, "Hey, Greg, about that rent thing you mentioned." He stopped chewing and looked at me like, "Yeah, what's up? Have you thought about how you're going to get the money?" And I said, "Well, it turns out I don't think I should pay you rent because technically this house is mine." Greg's fork froze in midair halfway to his mouth, and my mom literally dropped her water glass, which spilled all over the table, but she didn't even move to clean it up. Greg laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh. It was that nervous laugh people do when they don't know what else to do, and he said, "Very funny, Dylan. Seriously, stop with the drama and let's talk like adults." But I already had the papers in my backpack because I knew this was going to happen. So I took them out and put them on the table, avoiding the puddle of water, and said, "I'm not joking. Look, here are the documents. My dad left me the house when he died. It's been in my name since I turned 18 3 weeks ago." Greg's face went from confused to completely pale in like 2 seconds. He grabbed the papers and started reading them, his eyes moving quickly across the lines, and I watched as his expression became more and more tense. My mom finally reacted and said in a very quiet voice, "Dylan, where did you find those papers?" And I told her in her office that I was looking for my birth certificate. She stood up so fast her chair fell backward with a horrible noise and left the kitchen without saying anything else. I heard her bedroom door slam shut. Greg looked at me like he couldn't decide whether to be furious or shocked, and finally said, "This can't be real. There has to be some mistake." I told him there was no mistake, that it was all clear right there, that the house was mine and that if anyone was going to pay rent here, it was going to be him and my mom, not me. I don't know where I got the courage to say that. Honestly, it was the adrenaline of the moment, because normally I'm not confrontational at all. But something about his attitude the last few weeks, trying to squeeze $400 out of me when he'd been living for free in my house, really pissed me off. Greg left the papers on the table and stood up, his face now completely red, and said, "You're going to regret this, kid. You'll see." He left the house, slamming the door so hard it made the windows shake, and I was left sitting there alone with the cold chicken and spilled water, wondering what the hell had just happened and whether I'd done the right thing or if I'd just completely ruined my family life. The next few days were super awkward. My mom barely spoke to me, just the necessary stuff like, "Your clothes are clean or there's food in the fridge." Greg would disappear for hours without saying where he was going, and when he was home, he'd lock himself in the office he shared with my mom. I tried several times to talk to my mom, ask her why she never told me about the house, but she always found an excuse to walk away or said it wasn't a good time. One night, like a week after the big confrontation, I woke up at 2 in the morning because I heard voices downstairs. I went down the stairs as quietly as I could and saw my mom in the kitchen talking on the phone, her voice an urgent whisper. I heard fragments of the conversation, things like, "We can't keep hiding it. He has to know eventually. And no, I don't think we can handle it without him finding out." My heart was beating super hard because clearly she was talking about me, and clearly there were more secrets than I knew about. The next day, I decided to follow Greg when he left the house after lunch. I know that sounds paranoid and kind of stalkerish, but something about the whole situation had my nerves on edge and I needed to know what was going on. I followed him in my old car, staying like 2 cars back, feeling ridiculous but also determined. Greg drove to a coffee shop downtown, one of those hipster places with weird art on the walls, and went in. I watched him through the window sit down with an older guy, like 50 years old, dressed in a suit. They talked for almost an hour, and at one point I saw Greg pull papers out of his briefcase and show them to the other guy, who examined them carefully and then nodded. When Greg left the coffee shop, I waited a few minutes and then went in. The waiter was cleaning the table where they'd been sitting, and I casually asked him if he knew who the guy in the suit was who just left. The waiter looked at me weird but said, "Oh yeah, that's Mark. He works at First National Bank. He comes here all the time." My stomach sank because what was Greg doing, meeting with someone from the bank? And why in secret? That night, I confronted Greg and my mom during dinner. I told them I knew they were meeting with people from the bank and that I wanted to know what was going on. Greg got super defensive and said it was none of my business. But my mom put her hand on Greg's arm and said in a tired voice, "That's enough. He has to know." Greg looked at her like, "Are you sure?" And she just nodded with tears in her eyes. What my mom told me next basically made my world explode for the second time in 2 weeks. Turns out the house my dad left me, the house that was supposedly this wonderful inheritance, had an $80,000 mortgage on it that nobody had mentioned. $80,000. My mom explained through tears that my dad had refinanced the house right before he died to pay medical debts, and that she had been paying the mortgage all these years, thinking she would eventually pay it off before I turned 18 and found out. But things had been difficult financially, especially the last few years, and they still owed all that money. I asked her why they hadn't told me from the beginning. Why let me discover about the house in the most dramatic way possible without warning me about the debt? And my mom didn't have a real answer. She just kept saying, I'm sorry. I thought I could handle it. I didn't want to burden you with this." Greg finally spoke and admitted that's why he wanted to charge me rent. They were desperate for extra money to keep paying the mortgage, and his plan was to eventually refinance the house or take out a second mortgage now that I was of legal age and technically the owner. I felt completely betrayed, not just by the fact that they had hidden critical information about my own property from me, but because they had tried to manipulate me into paying for a problem they had created or at least perpetuated. I told them I needed time to process all this and locked myself in my room for the rest of the night, ignoring their attempts to talk more about it. During the next few days, I researched everything I could about mortgages and property debts. I called a financial advisor who offered free consultations, a guy named Steven who worked at the same bank where Greg had met with his contact. I explained the whole situation to him, and Steven was super patient with me, explaining options and consequences. He told me that with an $80,000 debt, we would need a solid payment plan that would probably take between 10 and 15 years to pay off completely. Or we could consider selling the house, although that would mean losing my dad's inheritance. I organized a meeting with Steven, my mom and Greg to discuss our options. It was super tense. All of us sitting in that cold bank office with its gray walls and plastic plants, while Steven explained different payment scenarios. My mom was crying quietly. Greg looked defeated, and I just wanted all this to be over. Steven presented a payment plan that would require us to contribute approximately $750 a month for the next 12 years, which sounded absolutely impossible considering our current incomes. But then I had an idea. I asked Steven if it would be possible to rent the house to someone else and use that income to pay the mortgage. Steven said, yes, that was definitely an option, although it would mean we would have to find another place to live. My mom and Greg looked at me like I was crazy, but the more I thought about it, the more sense it made. If we could rent the house for, say, $1,200 or $1,500 a month, we could pay the mortgage and still have something left over, and we could rent a smaller, cheaper apartment somewhere else. I presented the plan to my mom and Greg that night. Greg initially opposed it, saying it was ridiculous to move out of our own house, but I reminded him that technically it was my house and that I was trying to save it, instead of just selling it and forgetting about the problem. My mom was more receptive, admitting that maybe it was the only realistic way to handle the debt without financially ruining ourselves. I spent the next few weeks preparing the house to rent. I painted walls, fixed things that had been broken for years, cleaned every corner. I hired a cheap photographer I found on Craigslist to take decent photos, and we listed the house on several rental sites. We got like 15 responses in the first week, which surprised me but also stressed me out because I didn't know how to evaluate potential tenants. We finally found Jake and Olivia, a young, newly married couple. He worked in tech and she was a teacher. They seemed responsible and nice, and they passed the credit check without problems. They agreed to pay $1,400 a month, which was perfect for our needs. We signed a 1-year lease agreement, and we started packing our things to move to a 2-bedroom apartment we found like 20 minutes away. Just when I thought we had finally solved everything, 2 weeks before the move, I got a call from Steven at the bank. His voice sounded serious when he asked me to come to the office as soon as possible, that something important had come up during the final review of the house documents. My stomach sank because I already knew it wasn't going to be good news. In Steven's office, with my mom and Greg sitting next to me, Stephen explained that during his deeper investigation of the property, they had discovered an additional $50,000 lien on the house dating back 7 years, $50,000 more dollars. The room started spinning, and I felt like I couldn't breathe properly. I asked my mom if she knew anything about this, and by her completely devastated face, I knew the answer before she said a word. My mom finally confessed, her voice barely a whisper, that she had taken out a line of credit on the home equity years ago when Greg had lost his job for 6 months and they were desperate for money to pay bills. She had planned to pay it off before I turned 18 and never had to know, but things just didn't work out as she expected. Now we were looking at a total debt of $130,000 on a house that was probably worth like $180,000 according to current market prices. I yelled at her, something I'd never done before, asking how she could do something like that, how she could make such important decisions about my property without even telling me. Greg tried to calm me down, saying they were just trying to survive, but I was too furious to listen to excuses. I told my mom I couldn't believe she'd lied to me for so long, that she'd had literally years to tell me the truth and had chosen to hide it until she had no choice. Stephen gave us more numbers, more scenarios, more payment plans that now extended for 15 or even 20 years. The rental income would help, definitely, but it would no longer be enough to cover both debts and leave us something to live comfortably. We would need to make additional contributions each month, which meant we would all have to work more, save more, sacrifice more. That night, sitting in my room surrounded by half-packed boxes, I seriously thought about just selling the house and forgetting about this whole mess. It would be easier, it would clear the debts, and we'd have some money to start over, somewhere else. But every time I considered that option, I thought about my dad, William, who had worked hard to buy this house and who had wanted to leave it to me as a legacy. I didn't remember him well, but I felt I owed it to him, you know? I felt like giving up the house would be like giving up the only tangible thing that connected me to him. Jake and Olivia moved into the house as planned, apparently unaware of the financial drama behind their new home. We moved into our smaller apartment, where the walls are thin and I can hear the neighbors arguing at 3 inches the morning. My mom got a second part-time job at a clothing store. Greg started doing Uber at night after his regular job. And I increased my hours at the electronics store and also started doing freelance graphic design work that I learned on YouTube. The relationship with my mom is still tense. We talk, but there's this distance between us that didn't exist before, like trust was broken and neither of us knows how to fix it. Greg and I are civil with each other, but nothing more. Sometimes I think about what our life was like 6 months ago, when everything seemed normal and simple. And I wonder if we'll ever get back to that place, or if this is permanent now. Last month, I made the first big payment toward the debts, using the rental money, plus our combined contributions. It was strange to see that amount of money leave the account, but it also felt good in a way, like we were finally making real progress. Stephen says if we keep up this pace, we could pay off both debts in 14 years, which means I'll be 32 when the house is finally mine, free and clear. 14 years sounds like forever, but when I think about what my dad wanted for me when he left that house, when I think about not giving up on the only thing I have from him, somehow it feels manageable. I don't know if I'm making the right decision, keeping the house instead of selling it. Maybe in a few years I'll regret this choice, but for now, every time I drive by the house and see the lights on with Jake and Olivia living there, I remind myself that I'm fighting for something worthwhile, even if the road is long and difficult. And that's enough for now, I guess.